Have you ever said something and you go, why did I say that? Maybe you said it to your wife or your husband, or maybe your kids, or maybe your parents, or to your brother or your sister, or maybe a friend. Or in my case, maybe I said it from the pulpit in front of hundreds of people. And you just go, why did I say that? And the reason you said it is maybe just a careless moment. And it probably didn't mean anything, but it may have meant something to someone in a very negative way. It might have been offensive. There is in society a kind of a movement to deal with what are called microaggressions. I don't know if you've heard that term. Microaggressions is this idea. In fact, let me read to you a definition of microaggressions, kind of give us a foundation of what I want to share here. Microaggression is a term used for brief and commonplace daily verbal behavior or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative, prejudicial slights and insults toward any group, particularly culturally marginalized groups. Okay, that's a mouthful. What does all that mean? Microaggression is simply you've said something or shown something. A microaggression doesn't have to be verbal. You implied something that maybe you didn't mean, but may be offensive to a racial group or to a gender group or a sexual identity group. Microaggressions are usually understood as forms of subtle prejudice. So I can give you several examples, but there have been times where I've said things I wish I had never said. Welcome to Hope Rescue Podcast. By the way, if you have friends that you'd like to invite, send them to hoperescuepodcast.org. We'd love to have your friends listen in with us. We've been talking about Christian ethics, and for those of you listening, Kimberly's not here. She wasn't here last week. I'm getting away with a lot of stuff while she's gone. I don't have to be as circumspect, I'll put it that way. She's not the boss of me today. Anyway, so microaggressions are statements that are subtle prejudices. I'll give you some examples. It might help to understand what it is. If you were to say to a woman, which I would recommend never saying to a woman, "You're pretty smart for a woman," probably don't ever say that. And because you might get, "You're pretty out cold for a man," when you get knocked out. For example, I'm standing in my office one day years ago, and I had an executive assistant who's a black woman who had set up an appointment with a vendor. I had never met this man, and he set up the appointment with her on the phone. He had never met her. He walked in, and he walked up, and I, at the same time, walked into the office where he met her for the first time, and he said these words, "Oh my God, you're black." And I said, "Oh no, you are an idiot." And she was so gracious about it. She goes, "I have been black all my life," something like that. I was just like, okay. She just diffused that. And he said this, he made it worse. He said, "You don't even sound black." Those are microaggressions, really kind of stupid statements. They're careless, and they're maybe not meant to be harmful. Sometimes they're even meant to be a compliment. I'll give you a compliment. And by the way, when I'm going to say this, you're going to go, "Wait, you're ripping on this guy," because you're going to know his name as soon as I say it. So let me be careful and say that when he said this, probably about, probably 12 years ago, something like that, maybe a little longer. Joe Biden said this when he was a senator. He was not even considered to run with President Barack Obama. Senator Barack Obama was running, and he was close to winning the nomination from the Democratic Party. And this is what Joe Biden said, and I quote, "I mean, you got the first mainstream African American who is articulate and bright and clean and a nice looking guy. Biden said, I mean, that's a storybook, man. That's storybook, man. Now, it sounds like Joe Biden putting his foot in his mouth. And I know that he did not mean that as a racial slur. And he actually is trying to give a compliment, but in giving a compliment, like, you are above expectation for a black person. That's essentially what he's saying. That's what's called a microaggression. And that even borders line on aggression. I mean, he regretted that later when he got the reaction. One guy says to a black man, he said, "Did you grow up in the ghetto?" Okay, he goes, "Why would you ask that?" He goes, "Well, now he doesn't know what to say. The guy's black. Did you grow up in the ghetto?" Just irresponsible, insensitive. Those are called microaggressions. Asking a female doctor that walks in to your exam room and said, "Excuse me, nurse, when is the doctor coming in?" Because she's female, she can't be a doctor. That's a microaggression. My doctor's a female. She's told me horror stories because she's young, and she is often mistaken for a nurse. And actually, she's in charge of several hundred doctors because she's very high up in the organization where I go to have my medical work done. And she's an amazing doctor. And she's got a great sense of humor about it. She's not overly sensitive about it. She takes it in stride. But those are microaggressions. Here's which would not be considered microaggressions. Let me kind of flip the script here a little bit. For those of us who are Christians, we hear things like this: Christians are bigots. That's a microaggression. It's actually a generalization that is unkind, untrue, and ignorant. Christians hate women. Okay, really? Christians don't believe in science. That makes my blood boil when I hear people that don't follow good science to get their views of the existence of man and then debunk mine because mine don't follow their science. Anyway, Christians are ignorant. I've heard all of these. Christians hate homosexuals. We all know cops. This is not about Christians, but how about cops hate black people? I have a son who's a police officer. I'm like, that's pretty offensive. And they don't know his background and how he is far from racially hating black people. Some problems with the concept of microaggressions. There are true microaggressions, but here's some problems. It expands too widely the concept of prejudice. So what it does is it makes everybody suspect about everything they say. It is nitpicking everything that's ever said. Now, we need to be sensitive, and we need to not be so sensitive to other people's statements. But when we are so driven by concern over microaggressions, we kind of lose ourselves in the process. Second thing, it puts people on edge constantly. People are constantly feeling as though they're going to say something wrong. I grew up in a time where racial tension was really stronger than it is now. And the abuses were much stronger than they are now. And that was in the 60s. And in the 60s, there was an incredible insensitivity to black people. It puts people on edge when we've come so far, and yet there is a constant statement about white people that they are prejudice. That's a microaggression. Microaggressions can be considered against people who are in the majority. So the third thing is it promotes an overly sensitive society. Everybody's a victim. Everybody's worried about how they're being downtrodden. And we don't see people as, hey, you can do this, you can overcome, you can become somebody, kind of similar to what we talked about last week. But another thing is it creates a society of victims. People are constantly considering themselves victims. But so how do we approach this from a Christian perspective? Let me share with you. There are many verses we could go to, but listen to this one. Colossians 4:6. Let your speech always be gracious. Always be gracious. Is your speech always gracious? When you think of the way you talk to your spouse, are you being gracious? When you speak to your children, are you being gracious? Excuse me. Are you gracious when you talk to your friends, when you talk to your coworkers, when you talk to people in society, when you talk to a barista, when you talk to a server at a restaurant? Do you show sensitivity? Are you gracious? So he says, let your speech always be gracious. Then he says this, seasoned with salt. I love that. Hold on just a minute. I got to cough and drink some water here. Oh, that's so much better. There's a cough. We're all done. We're back. Seasoned with salt. So you're gracious in your speech, and that speech, in order for it to be gracious, is seasoned with salt. What salt does is it enhances the flavor. It doesn't overbear. It is something that enhances what is said, and so that the taste is better. So when you think of communicating your speech, are you thinking about how this speech, to use the metaphor of Colossians 4, how does it taste to the listener? Is it palatable? Is it something that is, you really can appreciate and enjoy? Are they encouraged? So that you may know how you ought to answer each person. I many times have said things I wish I could take back. There are things I've said years ago that if I think about them, I actually blush. I mean, and nobody remembers it but me, I hope. There are things I've said publicly that were so stupid, and they weren't microaggressions. They were just stupid statements that I wish I could take back. But, that's the nature. We're imperfect. But what we can do, this is what I've learned in raising 7 children, 7 teenagers in my home is going to evoke, especially in me, a very emotional person, is going to evoke some response from time to time. There are things I'd like to take back, and I can't. The only thing that I can do is to go and say, you know what? What I said was not kind, and I'm sorry. And I maybe meant it at the moment, but I don't mean it. I love you, and I care about you. And, and apologizing, taking responsibility. That's true on, quote, microaggressions as well. Sometimes you can't take it back. So we need to be careful. And so what Paul says to the church at Colossae, let your speech be seasoned like salt. Let it be gracious. Listen to this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 8, Paul was writing to a church that's going through a real difficult time. They're divided. They're in a difficult problem. And one of the things they're divided about was a doctrinal thing. It's really not so much theological as it is doctrinal. And the doctrinal thing was that in Corinth, there was a temple. And in this temple, they had, it was a pagan temple. It wasn't the, Jewish temple. It was a pagan temple. And what they would do is bring to the temple animals, sacrifices. And they would sacrifice these animals to the gods. And these false gods were supposedly appeased by this. So they would bring the best of the animals. When they'd bring the best of the animals, they would then sacrifice the animals. And, they would take, the temple was a little unscrupulous. They would take the lesser meat and burn it up in the burnt offerings, and the blood offerings would be given. And then they would take the good meat, and they actually sold it in a restaurant there, which was adjacent to the temple. And then also there was a marketplace in the King James that I learned at 1 Corinthians 8. It was called the Shambles. It was a place where they would sell things in the market, and they would sell meat there. And the best meat you could get anywhere was sold in the temple market. And the reason it was the best meat is because people would bring the best animals for sacrifice. So Christians were buying meat there, and they would, cook it up in their barbecue or however they did it in those days. And so it became a big doctrinal debate. Wait a minute, if that meat had been offered to idols in the idol's temple, the idol's temple, what would happen was they would be contaminated by demonic sources. And Paul writes to the church at Corinth and says, that's not true at all. There is no such thing as an idol. Yes, they worship idols, but they are nothing to a God of creation. Idols are nothing. They're an imagination of people who've created their own false gods. So it can't contaminate the meat. The meat is not contaminated, and you should eat it with thanksgiving. Now, having said all that, listen to what he says in 1 Corinthians 8. This is verse 7. Not all possess this knowledge. So there are people that don't know what Paul had just taught, but some, through former association with idols, so before they got saved, they were idol worshipers. They'd eat food as really offered to an idol, and their conscience, being weak, is defiled. In other words, because they were former idol worshipers before they became Christians, they're very sensitive to idol worship, and they think it's absolutely wrong. Of course, idol worship is wrong, but the meat is contaminated is what they thought. You ever meet an ex-smoker, somebody that smoked cigarettes for years and they quit? They are like the cigarette Nazis. They will preach at you. I don't smoke cigarettes, but they will preach at you like crazy. They're the ones policing everybody about that. That's how these guys were. They had a weak conscience, not a strong conscience. When you have a false moral standard for something that is not a biblical issue, Paul calls it a weak conscience. You've been defiled by your own weak conscience. Food will not commend us to God, he says. We are no worse off if we do not eat it, nor are we any better if we do eat it. But take care that the right of yours, those of you who are eating meat that was formerly offered to idols, but take care that your right does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak, those who have a weak conscience. For if anyone sees you who have knowledge eating in an idol's temple, in other words, in the restaurant, will not be encouraged if his conscience is weak to eat food offered to idols. In other words, you will encourage them. You will be a stumbling block to them, getting them to do something that they think is wrong. So what do we learn from this? When we talk about microaggressions, we have to understand that there are some people that are easily offended, which was the case with these people. They were offended by something that Paul said they should not be offended by, but they have a weak conscience. And your brothers and sisters in Christ, many of them have a weak conscience about different things. There are people that have standards. We talked a few weeks ago about drinking wine. Of course, wine was commended in both the Old and the New Testament. And the abusing of wine is a different thing, but drinking in moderation was never forbidden, except under certain vows and so forth. But there are people that have a weak conscience. Would you drink wine in front of them? I think we need to understand that. There are other people that possibly have a problem with alcohol, alcoholism. You wouldn't drink in front of them. So anyway, the point being that what if somebody is overly sensitive about certain things, their gender, their sexuality, their race, their religious beliefs, their attractiveness or unattractiveness, their body type, too thin, too tall, too short, too big, too, whatever. People can see these as microaggressions. Now, if I'm speaking to them, they need to toughen up. But if I'm speaking to you as a listener, I'm telling you, you need to be sensitive. So we need to do both of those things. Number one, learn that the law of love is greater than the law of liberty. That's what Paul is teaching. Let me explain what I mean. The law of love says, my love causes me to set aside my right to eat the meat that was offered to idols because it's no big deal to God. Paul says it's okay. God's fine with that. So I could eat this meat offered to idols. But the law of love says, I'm going to set aside that right, my law of liberty. I have the liberty to do it. I'm going to set aside that liberty out of the love for someone else. So Paul put it this way in later in the chapter. He says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are expedient. All things are lawful, but I will not become a stumbling block. He said a similar thing in chapter 6, where he would not come under the power of it. We talked about that a couple of weeks ago. But we don't need to be a stumbling block or an offense to other people that have a weak conscience. Here's another thing. Keep your focus on the most important thing. When you're talking about your possibility for microaggressions, say, I am tired of people analyzing every single thing I say. Well, you can go with that pattern, but if you're focused on the most important thing and that is the love of God, then you're going to try to season your speech with salt. You're going to be gracious, and you're going to go, okay, why do I have to be judged by people who are overly sensitive? Well, it may be that maybe you just need to be sensitive to them. Another thing is, it's never a weakness to defer to a weaker brother. It doesn't make you weak to love someone well. And I was talking to a guy one day, and he has a sensitivity about his weight. And I was challenging him. We were talking about working out, and I was challenging him to get into the gym. And I realized, even though we were having kind of an honest discussion, I realized he felt that I was judging him for his weight. And so I approached it. I said, hey, I feel like our conversation has gotten a little weird. And he said, I just feel like you're rejecting me because I'm overweight. And I said, I thought we were talking about how to get healthy, and I was trying to give my insight on that, and I certainly did not mean to be offensive to you. Part of me was thinking, gosh, he's overly sensitive about this. And then the other side of me is how many times I felt overly sensitive about things. Different physical traits, or I remember when I was, really skinny, and I was made fun of, and I've been made fun of about the size of my nose or my ears or whatever, and those things make you sensitive. And microaggressions are usually things that we go, well, maybe they're being sensitive. Of course, you want to be sensitive to how people feel if you're driven by the love of God. Season your words with salt, as he said. Make sure that people understand your intentions are to love them well. Understand that people need further communication. It is sometimes, I was talking about one time, one of those things that I was super embarrassed about. I was talking about playing basketball. I played basketball on a team where for a season I was the only white guy on the team. I've made mention of that fact. And I was playing basketball, and this guy just was out, he's more skilled at basketball than I was. And I had made mention of the fact that, he grew up playing basketball, and I had said something about his race. I don't remember how it came out. And right after I said it, I realized that's going to be taken wrong. And I just tried to kind of get through the message. And afterwards, I got so many notes from people. None of the people in our church who were black said anything. It was all white people offended for their black brothers. And, the only way I could deal with it is to get up the next week and go, you know what, I did not mean to be insensitive. And I was. And I apologize, and I realized it was a microaggression. It was something I needed to be more sensitive about, and just didn't handle it well. But you can fix those things. I did it publicly, so I publicly dealt with that. Another thing is, when you fail to be sensitive, come back with that apology, just like I said. When someone is hateful to you, instead of getting over sensitive, and speaking to those of you who are overly sensitive to microaggressions, talk to them. Don't assume that they're a racist or they're a sexist or they're they're homophobic or xenophobic. Maybe they're just not sensitive or they're somewhat ignorant. Let's communicate. We do not need to be divided as a society. And I think with an overemphasis on microaggression, what happens is we lose ourselves in offense. But in not being sensitive in the way we communicate, we are not loving people well. So the best thing to do is talk through it. I have many times marveled at my wife's ability to say, hey, wait a minute, what you said was painful for me to hear. I've made comments about people in the earshot of my daughters, and I regret those, and I've tried to go back and fix that the best I can. Careless statements about other women need to be careful about that, especially in the earshot of other women. We need to be sensitive to how people are going to hear what we say. And then for those of you who are sensitive about what is said by other people, I would say to you, talk through it with them. If you have opportunity to say, hey, what did you mean by that? And, I don't know any racists in my life. The people I know that are racist, I really have nothing to do with them. I really don't want to be around people like that. But I do know this, that godly men and godly women do not hate people because of their race. That is not a godly trait. Godly men and godly women do not hate people because of their sexuality. Even if they disagree with it, they don't hate them. That is not a godly trait. That is not Christ-like. Godly men and godly women do not hate people of a different gender, whether it's men or women. Godly men or godly women don't hate people because of their physical appearance. That is not godly. Godly men and women love well. The greatest proof that you love Jesus, they will know by your fruit, and your fruit, Jesus says, is that you love. Do you love people? And if you love people, it's going to come out in your speech. So here's what I would say. Here's the greatest tip I could give for anyone that's concerned about committing microaggressions. If you can get your heart changed, if you can begin to submit your heart to God and really love everyone, you're not going to have to worry about microaggressions because love is going to come from you. Romans chapter 5, verse 5 says this, the love of God is shed abroad. Listen to this. The love of God is shed abroad from your hearts by means of the Holy Spirit. Romans 5:5. So the Holy Spirit that dwells within you will allow God's love to just kind of ooze out to people who are different than you, who are the same as you. So let's love well. Let's surrender to God and allow God to love people through us and through our words. Thanks for listening to Hope Rescue Podcast. We'll be back next week, and we hope that you'll be encouraged this week to speak well, seasoned with salt, full of grace. God bless. We'll see you then.